Could you just explain what oral history is?
So it's basically like an interview where you're getting somebody's testimony, right? You're getting somebody's experience about a particular topic. In this case, we're going to be talking about the protests that have been going on and sort of sweeping over New York. We're living in a historic moment, and politics has shifted dramatically because of this moment, because of a movement that many of your peers and family members are involved in. What you're doing through this oral history, when you sit down and interview somebody who's been involved in these events, is you're documenting their story. And when historians and when scholars and journalists write about this moment that really is shifting the conversation, that's changing history, you're going to be a part of that conversation. So that's pretty cool. The idea for this is you're going to be conducting an oral history with somebody in your social network. So somebody you're familiar with. When you interview them, you are allowed to be familiar with them. You don't have to worry about sounding super formal. You want to be comfortable. You want them to be comfortable. So it's important that you interview somebody that you know, probably, right? A friend from school, a family member. And you're going to be talking about police violence and the mass protests that are currently sweeping our city and our nation. Ideally, your interview will be at least 15 minutes. It's going to be a little more difficult right now just because of COVID. Most of you are going to be doing these interviews over the phone. But after we get through this, I believe that all of you can probably achieve that 15-minute mark. So ideally, you're going to be choosing somebody who's directly involved in the protest movement. This can be a classmate, as I said, who's protested on the streets. It could be a police officer. It could be a community member involved in local politics. Or if you have a friend who's particularly active online, maybe they're worth talking to about sort of what's going on. If you can't find someone directly involved in what's been happening since George Floyd's murder in May 2020, find somebody who's strongly opinionated. That's good enough, right? Because they're still reflecting in real time on the moment that's going on. You are the architect of this interview. If you are uncomfortable asking a question, don't ask that question, right? If you find that your interviewee is uncomfortable answering a question, don't pursue it. It's okay, right? We want to get stories that people are comfortable with. We don't want to make anybody uncomfortable here.
So this is technically an interview, not an interrogation. You're not doing a police interrogation.
You don't want them to ask what level encounter this is by the end of it. That's really, that's not what we're doing here. Again, this is going to be part of a collection that we're starting at Gutman. You can click on this link right here, and it'll sort of show you what we've created so far, which is very small. But right now, we have a massive grant to expand this to about 100 oral histories. And so you're going to be a part of a really cool collection that documents the experiences of the community surrounding the college in historic times. All right, so now you see online, this is the Gutman Oral History Collection. We could click and listen to interviews.
Hey, Sylvia, how old are you?
You're going to be a part of this collection that we're building. And then when you click also, you could read a transcript. This makes it accessible to everybody. This is where your oral history will be stored. Your interview will be stored. And this collection is going to expand massively, like I said, in the next few months. All right, so before the interview, make sure that you figure out how you're going to record the interview. If this is just on your phone and this is a family member who lives in your household, COVID makes things complicated. There are apps on both iPhones and Androids that allow you to record very easily. If it's over the phone that you're going to be doing this interview, what most people have done is either take two phones and do the interview on speaker and record it on the second phone, or there are many apps that you could download. Some of them cost a few dollars. I don't want you guys to spend any money on this. If you can find a free app that allows you to record calls, you can do that as well. You could also set up the interview as a Zoom call and record the Zoom call like I'm doing right now. That's another way to do this. And then that's actually cooler in some ways because we get the visuals.
21st century.
25, I know, it's a crazy new world out there, Gary. It's important that you practice recording. You want to make sure whatever strategy you use works, right? And while the interview is going on, you want to make sure that it's actually recording. You don't want to waste your time having done it and then telling somebody, thank you for sharing all your deepest, darkest secrets with me. We have to do it again because I messed up the recording. That's not what you want to happen, you know? We really need them to know what they're getting into, right? They need to know this isn't just a conversation that is going to be shared between 30 people in a classroom or me and Professor Graves. This is a conversation that is going to inform future generations about what was going on in 2020. And if they're not comfortable with that, then they shouldn't be interviewed, right?
Yeah, this is going to be archived so that somebody 50 years from now or 100 years from now
Or tomorrow.
will be able to, or tomorrow.
During the interview, as soon as the interview starts and as soon as you start recording, make sure that they know that you're recording the call. You tell them over the recording, by the way, I'm recording this call. You're cool with that. And then at the beginning of the conversation, I want you to go over the consent form.
This oral history project is being conducted by, you would write your name, you're the interviewer, a student at Gutman Community College, City University of New York, I should know that. By signing the form below, you, the interviewee, so now this is referring to the person you're interviewing, have granted permission for the audio recordings, notes, transcripts, video, and photographs resulting from this interview to be gifted to a collection held at City University of New York without restriction. If you, the interviewee, have granted permission to do so, the interview may become a part of an archive, and the interviews will be made available for use consistent with City University of New York's mission, regulated according to any restrictions placed on their use by you, the interviewee, and or the interviewer. So this is really important, right? They're allowed to say, you know, I don't want to use my name. And then if they do that, we have to have a conversation beforehand about the best way to conduct an interview when you're not using somebody's name, because it can't be on the recording then. They could say, I don't want this to be released for a little bit. All of that's fine. But again, if there are some restrictions that are going to be placed, you and I have to have a conversation about how to handle that. The second paragraph, I, and then the interviewee, which is the person you are interviewing, have read the above. The interviewer affirms that he or she or they has explained the nature and purpose of this oral history. The interviewee affirms that she, he, or they has consented to the interview. The interviewer and the interviewee hereby give, grant, and assign all rights, title, and interest, including copyright of whatever kind from this information and interview to Gutman Community College, City University of New York, with the following restrictions. This is where you write the restrictions. If they want this interview to be held on to for a little bit, you say the interview shall be closed to researchers until the following date, and then you write the date. Then you put the date of the interview. You write your full name. Your full name comes first. You are the interviewer. You sign it. Then they write their full name, and they sign it.
The person whom you are interviewing, if they're not in your house, you're going to have to, maybe scan it. There are a bunch of apps you could download on your phone that scan. You could email them this form. You're going to have this form. You could use Adobe to put it down, or you could, worst case scenario, take a photo of it, send them the photo, they print out the photo, they sign the form. They have to sign the form for us to be able to make this a public interview. You write their full name here and they sign down here. That's all you got to do. During the interview, it's important not to be judgmental of their responses. If they say something that you don't agree with necessarily, you don't be like, what did you say? I can't believe that. Because what's going to happen if they do that, Gary?
Interview's over.
The interview's over. They're going to shut down, right? And
there's going to be an argument.
It's just, that's not what we're looking for here. We want their truth, right?
Yeah.
If they're talking about an experience with police officers and you have very strong opinions about police officers, you don't have to announce to them, these are my really strong opinions about police officers, because then they're going to start telling the story in a way to make sure that you're happy. And be casual. You know this person, right? You don't have to be stiff. You don't have to, be very formal, use words that you never used before. Talk to them like you normally talk to them. If you curse, it is not a big deal. That's a way to get people to open up. You want them to be able to give the fullest version of their truth. During the interview, give cues that you're listening, that you're not just, tuning out, right? Especially if this is over the phone, you got to tell people that you're still interested. little sounds over the phone like or sure, or things like that give the indication that you're listening. That's helpful. Another thing that's really useful is if you have good follow-up questions. If you're asking them about what they're saying, then they know that you're listening. If you're asking them about random things that they're not saying, then they think you're not listening, right? So it's important to ask follow-up questions based on what they're saying. So when they're talking, you should be taking notes, right? You should be thinking, all right, well, that's interesting. How can I build on that? What more do I need from that? It sounds like there's a story there. If I only ask one more question, how do I get that story?
So when somebody has finished saying something or explaining something, and you see, and they might have touched on something maybe interesting or kind of interesting, it's okay to maybe follow up with that particular question or that particular comment or that particular area that they were just talking about.
It's super important. It's like it's the heart of the interview, right? You really, really, really want people to know that you're listening, and you want to build on what they're saying. Because if it's just an assortment of random questions that were predetermined beforehand, that's not useful for anybody, right? You're trying to get the best stories out of them, and the way that you do that is you're an active listener. You listen to what they say. Oh my gosh, that's really interesting. I need to follow up with that. Doesn't mean you interrupt them, right? You don't interrupt them. That's why you write it down right next to you. But you listen to what they're saying, and from what they're saying, you're coming up with new questions, new avenues to sort of question them on. And this is a really important thing. You're going to see a list of questions. We're going to go over them in just a minute. That's not the end of it.
So it's okay to go off on a tangent.
If the tangent is totally irrelevant to what you're trying to get at, the protest, right? If they start talking about their favorite ice cream flavors, let them talk, whatever, and then you redirect it back to what are we talking about, right? But if they're saying, and like I've had a history of bad encounters with the cops, and then they go on talking and talking, you go back to, could you talk to me a little bit about that history of bad encounters with the cops? I'd like some more details there. I really want to understand it. It's important to get out all the information that we're trying to get out of these questions, but you could change any of these questions. The only thing you have to not change and has to be exactly the same is this first thing. My name is Samuel Feinsary, and today I am interviewing Gary Graves in the computer. I'm in New Jersey. He's in his home in
Brooklyn, New York, the center of the universe.
I've heard of it. Today's date is Sunday, July 5th, 2020.
Professor Graves, do you give me permission to record and distribute this oral history?
You're going to know a lot of this early information, right? Question number 2. And so I already know who I'm interviewing. I could just write his name in. I don't know his age. It's important for some of these to get their age. Some people aren't going to want to give you their age. That's fine. What he does for a living. He is a professor at CUNY. I don't have to ask him these questions. His racial identity. I could ask him, how do you identify racially? What gender do you identify as? What are your preferred pronouns? What is your sexual orientation? This information is useful. It's not necessary if anybody's uncomfortable giving any of this information. They don't have to. If you're uncomfortable asking for any of this information, you don't have to. All right? The point is that when people in 200 years are trying to document this history, it's nice for them to sort of have some qualifiers to understand whom we're talking about. It's not necessary, though. The story is what's important. All right? You could ask where they're from, right? Tell me a long story of how you or your family ended up in New York City, right? For a lot of people, certainly in our community at Gutman, it's lots of immigrant stories, right? That's an interesting conversation. Some people have come from other parts of the country. That's going to change their perception of racism. If they're coming from the U.S. South, there's a different version of racism in the U.S. South. They're coming from the DR, there are different versions of racism in those places. There are different relationships between police officers and civilians in those places. We need to sort of understand where they're coming from and how they ended up in New York. All right?
So I think it's probably best to start with coronavirus. Again, you can reorder this if you want, but certainly coronavirus started in the imagination of New Yorkers long before the massive protests that we've seen since the murder of George Floyd swept over the nation. So I would start with coronavirus. How has coronavirus changed your life? What was it like to be home so often? I think these sort of questions are revealing in terms of sort of the shift that this individual experienced. How did it impact you mentally and emotionally to be both home all the time, to have coronavirus haunting the streets, to have family members get sick? How did it impact you socially, right? That has been a big part of all of your lives. How did it impact your family, right? Was your family going through anything? Did any of them get sick? Did you have to be separate from your family in ways that you didn't before? These are all questions that sort of fill in the experience in New York. I mean, New York was one of the epicenters of coronavirus, if not the early epicenter of coronavirus. And so learning this information is super useful, right? Are people in your household working? Have they been working for a long time? I wrote follow-up here. I think it's important to, depending on what they say, to ask additional questions. How does that make you feel? Do you feel safe about that? Do you wish that they weren't working? Do you think it's strange how people with wealthier professions generally can work from home, and folks who are doing essential work are forced to go in and potentially suffer consequences because they're being exposed to coronavirus? What have you learned about yourself and your family since the beginning of this crisis? I mean, you have been in this house with your family in a way that probably you hadn't been before, right? So I find that one pretty interesting. What has been the hardest part of this pandemic for you? Has there been anything positive to come out of the pandemic for you? A lot of people have learned a new skill or have gotten closer to their family, right? So you would have to ask follow-up questions for these sort of things. And what do you think the nation and the world should learn from this pandemic? Then you tell them, all right, we're going to move on to talk about the protests. The way that I like to frame this, and again, you could frame this however you want, as sort of a starting point, pretend I'm an alien. I just came down to Earth. Explain to me why these protests erupted. I think that's an interesting way that'll allow them to give a lot of details and yeah, so I like to frame the question in that way, but again, you can do whatever you're comfortable with. Why do you think New York City became an epicenter of these protests? How have the uprisings across the country shifted how you think about your ethnic identity, and your place in U.S. society? So for a lot of people, they began to sort of find commonality with other people who identify similarly to them because it became so obvious, the racial inequities in our city and in our nation. And so I want you to explore this with the person you've chosen to interview, who probably is active in these protests, right? That's why you're interviewing them. Do you have any stories you're willing to share about encounters you have had with racism or the police? Again, you want to make sure the person understands they don't have to answer any of the questions, but this is a really interesting one that I think will open up a lot of doorways and give insight into the background for why they've explored or taken the path that they have. And so I think that's pretty useful. Are more stories among friends and family members being shared about racism and the police since the protests have started? I found this really fascinating, right? The way that human-to-human networks have been sharing stories that you never heard before, right? Or were kept as secrets. Now people, I think, in a really positive way, feel much more comfortable to talk about, what I experienced here was super racist. And so I feel like I've learned a lot from my non-white friends about just sort of racism in the city and how police treat them so differently than I did. Now, I was aware of some of this stuff beforehand, but I feel like the protests and the national conversation has really shifted, and so people are much more open. Have you learned about an experience of someone close to you? I find, again, those are useful stories. Sometimes they'll say, I haven't personally experienced racism or negative encounters with police. Then you could follow up with, what about somebody close to you? So again, hypothetically, you are choosing somebody who is involved in the protests in some way. So were you at all involved in digital or in protest activism of the last 6 months? If so, how so? Why did you decide to get involved? How have the protests in the context of coronavirus shifted the way you think about race in America? I think a lot of people have sort of altered their point of view. I know that the center has drastically shifted. You went from the NFL blackballing Colin Kaepernick to Black Lives Matter being on the courts of the NBA and Roger Goodell going on an apology tour because of this, right? So the center has shifted in a way, although there has been backlash of late. So we want to understand how for that person individually, that their conception of race and racism in America has shifted. How have the past few months changed how you think about police and racism in the U.S.? Did you learn more about the history of racism in this country since the protests started? What I have found fascinating about this is people have gotten educated, right? People have learned the history of the development of the police force as slave catchers. I mean, that is a large part of the development of the police force in this country, as we'll talk about more in this class. People have learned about sort of the history of the 13th Amendment and how it sort of legalized slavery if you'd been convicted of a crime. And then after the 13th Amendment is passed, which is during the Civil War, you see a shoot up in the criminalization of black and brown folks. So I find it really interesting how it's become sort of a form of popular education. And so that's what I'm hoping you can unravel in your interviews with the person who's been so active in this protest that you've chosen. What have you seen your peers doing that inspires you? A lot of people aren't just activists, but they're also comrades and part of a community, right? And so understanding how they look at other people around them and how they're inspired by the people around them, I think that's really useful. Can you be more specific? We always want specificity. We always want to have follow-up questions. What do you think about the local and national government's response to the protests that began in May 2020? So we're talking everything from the police to the mayor's office to the governor to President Trump, right? We want details on each of those. They don't have to be a collective. They can be separate. I feel this about this group. This group was okay on this one, but not so great on this. This other person or the president, he made me feel this sort of way. That's what we're looking for here. All right. How would you like to see this movement resolved? A lot of people have a vision of what a more equitable society looks like, and so that's what we're looking for here. And then what is your role in achieving that outcome? I think people, they need to think of themselves as whatever they think of themselves. We're trying to understand that, right? As an activist, how do you see yourself as a change maker? And I think that can be very powerful. Is there anything else about the anti-racist uprisings that you'd like to share? I think that this gives them an opportunity to go into depth about something that maybe they didn't. Then we see here additional questions created based on the respective interviewees. You guys all know the people that you are interviewing. And so it's very important that you create questions based on the experiences that you know they've had, right? And so I've given you space for 10 questions here. You have to create at least 5. That is your homework. And so you make sure you do that, and those questions get asked. They don't have to be asked at the end. They probably shouldn't be asked at the end, but you will splice them throughout the rest of this interview. All right.
If you're interviewing somebody who has found their path to this through religion, then talk about religion. If you found somebody who's found their path through this because of a personal experience that they've had with police officers in the past, talk to them about that, right? You want to make this so it's useful so that you're getting the best stories out of it.